The First World War left behind roughly 40 million casualties and a physically shattered European continent. For the survivors standing in the wreckage of 1918, there was a desperate overriding consensus. A conflict of this scale could never be allowed to happen again. The Allied powers drafted the Treaty of Versailles as a dictated peace, bypassing any meaningful negotiation with the defeated German government. They inserted Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept total legal responsibility for the conflict and pay massive financial reparations that crushed its domestic economy. To enforce this fragile post-war order, the treaty established the League of Nations, an international body designed to settle disputes through arbitration. But the organization was built with two fatal structural flaws. The United States refused to join, depriving the League of primary economic and military muscle. And because decisions required a unanimous vote, any single member could veto military action. 10 years later, the 1929 stock market crash triggered a global depression that acted as an economic accelerant. As unemployment skyrocketed and inflation destroyed life savings, desperate and starving populations lost faith in slow, bureaucratic democracies. They began voting for radical, authoritarian leaders who promised rapid stabilization and national pride. Millions of angry, impoverished citizens were living under an international security apparatus that could not actually enforce its own rules. This vacuum created an environment primed for authoritarian exploitation. Japan provided the first test of that security apparatus. Hit heavily by the global depression and desperate to secure foreign coal and iron deposits, the Japanese military invaded the Chinese province of Manchuria in September 1931. China, a fellow member of the League of Nations, officially appealed for help. The League took nearly a year to investigate the crisis, ultimately asking Japan to politely withdraw. They authorized no military intervention and imposed no economic sanctions. Japan simply resigned from the League and kept the territory. Watching this success, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini launched his own campaign of imperial conquest. In October 1935, Italian forces invaded Abyssinia, the independent African nation now known as Ethiopia. Once again, the international community balked. The League attempted to impose a ban on weapons sales, but it had no standing army to enforce the policy. Britain and France, hoping to keep Mussolini as an ally against a rising Germany, refused to close the Suez Canal to Italian supply ships. Italy conquered and annexed the country. Two major regional powers invaded sovereign nations, and the global security system did absolutely nothing to stop them. For watching fascist leaders, the lesson was obvious. The international community was bluffing, and aggressive expansion carried zero real risk. In July 1936, a failed military coup in Spain erupted into a full-scale civil war. The country split between the nationalists, a coalition of conservative, military, and fascist factions, and the Republicans, who supported the democratically elected government. While Western democracies declared a policy of non-intervention, totalitarian regimes flooded the conflict. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini sent thousands of troops, tanks, and aircraft to support the nationalist rebels. The Soviet Union answered by sending weapons and military advisors to back the Republicans. Spain rapidly became a lethal testing ground for modern warfare. In April 1937, German and Italian planes bombed the Basque town of Guernica for 3 hours, deliberately targeting civilians. It was the world's introduction to the concept of terror bombing. Over 3 years, the Axis powers used the Spanish terrain as a strategic dress rehearsal. They refined their dive bombing tactics, upgraded their communication radios, and practiced coordinating infantry with armor. They were training their militaries for a broader European conflict, while the rest of the continent watched passively. By late 1937, the German military was battle-tested, and its economy was stabilized through massive deficit spending on rearmament. On November 5th, Hitler convened a highly classified meeting with his top military commanders at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The Hossbach Memorandum detailed a specific, calculated schedule for European conquest, explicitly targeting Austria and Czechoslovakia. Hitler argued Germany required Lebensraum, living space, for national survival. To secure this land, he set a strict deadline of 1943. After that date, Germany's weaponry would become obsolete. 4 months later, this blueprint became reality. In March 1938, German troops crossed the border to annex Austria, an event known as the Anschluss. Internal opposition from conservative German generals was quickly purged. The Hossbach Memorandum confirmed a large-scale European war was no longer a vague political possibility. It was an active schedule being executed exactly as planned. Right on schedule, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. In September 1938, he threatened a military invasion to seize the Sudetenland, a mountainous border region containing critical Czech military fortifications and 3 million ethnic Germans. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain led the diplomatic response. Chamberlain was driven by a singular goal: preventing another generation of young men from dying in trenches. Britain and France simply did not feel militarily prepared to fight Nazi Germany. On September 30th, leaders from Britain, France, Italy, and Germany signed the Munich Agreement. Without consulting the Czechoslovak government, they surrendered the Sudetenland to Germany. In return, Hitler signed a piece of paper promising he had no further territorial demands in Europe. This strategy is known as appeasement, a diplomatic policy of making political concessions to an aggressive power to avoid conflict. But by handing over heavily fortified, democratic territory to a totalitarian regime, Britain and France didn't secure peace. They merely removed the last geographic obstacle to Hitler's expansion. The promise made in Munich lasted less than 6 months. On March 15, 1939, Hitler violated the agreement, sending his forces to occupy the remainder of the Czech lands. The illusion of a peaceful settlement shattered, and Britain and France finally abandoned the policy of appeasement. Realizing that Hitler's ambitions were strictly imperialistic, they drew a hard line, formally guaranteeing that they would militarily defend the borders of Poland against any attack. Hitler prepared for that attack by neutralizing his largest strategic threat. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. On September 1, 1939, German troops poured across the Polish border. 2 days later, honoring their diplomatic guarantee, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. The descent into the most destructive conflict in human history did not happen overnight. From the muddy trenches of 1918 to the invasion of Poland 20 years later, the international community consistently backed down from enforcing its own security agreements. By prioritizing temporary stability over the difficult work of confronting aggression early, they ensured the war they finally had to fight would be total.